Hello, everyone. A ceremony born in Nevada crossed the plains in a single year and ended with a snow-covered day of blood. Why did that happen? Join us as we open the files, verify sources, and get to the truth. January 1889 to December 1890. From Nevada Basin and Range to the Northern Plains, a ceremony of renewal moved across winter roads faster than officials expected. Families carried songs and reports home. Telegraph lines carried fear. The principal actors are clear. Wovoka, also called Jack Wilson among the Numa Paiute, shaped the teaching near Mason Valley, Nevada in the winter of 1889. Delegations from Arapaho and Cheyenne country listened and returned east. By spring and summer 1890, communities of Oglala, Lakota, Oyate at Pine Ridge Agency and Hunkpapa, Lakota at Standing Rock Agency adapted the dance to local needs under ration stress. Indian agents filed dispatches to Washington. Army commanders watched railheads and road crossings in Dakota Territory. The setting was precise and pressured. The Great Sioux Reservation had been cut in 1889. Agency boundaries tightened movement, grazing leases and rail spurs pressed into daily life. Boarding schools pulled children away. Drought and market swings thinned rations. In this frame, a message of moral code and world renewal promised order after loss. The question is direct. What carried the ghost dance from Nevada to Lakota agencies within a single year? And why did fear, rather than dialogue, decide the outcome? The film follows the routes that linked camps and offices. It traces how letters, interpreters, and returning delegates formed a network that outpaced policy. It marks the moments when administrative caution shifted into arrest orders and troop deployments. The stakes are human and historical. A ceremony meant as hope met a state seeking control. The result fixed December 1890 at Wounded Knee Creek in national memory and left communities to carry both grief and continuance into the next century. The prelude runs across two calendars. In Nevada, the winter of 1888 to 1889 brought drought and an eclipse that fixed attention on signs in the sky. Wage work on nearby ranches faltered. Agency rations thinned. In that season, Wovoka offered a strict moral path and a round dance that promised renewal. Messengers carried the teaching out of Mason Valley by spring 1889. By late 1889, Arapaho and Cheyenne delegations had returned east with letters and spoken accounts. Through early 1890, the news reached the Northern Plains, where Oglala and Hunkpapa communities waited against a decade of policy pressure. The deeper frame was treaty and statute. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 had promised a large land base and rations in lieu of the buffalo economy. The Black Hills Rush and the 1807 Act cut that promise. The Dawes Allotment Act of 1887 advanced individual parcels and the sale of surplus lands. In 1889, a new agreement divided the Great Sioux Reservation into smaller agencies and opened millions of acres. Each step narrowed common range and widened federal reach. Each step also produced ledgers and rules that touched food movement and ceremony. Land and resource pressures were constant by 1890. The buffalo herds were gone. Cattle leases ran across former hunting grounds. Homesteads and fences set new lines. Railroads fixed time with whistle posts and telegraph huts. Mining in the Black Hills and freight to railheads near Rapid City and Chadron drew labor and drew surveillance. Agency warehouses counted flour and beef against ledgers. Shortfalls in contracts and a dry year meant ration cuts just as winter approached. Administration shifted in tone and tools. Warfare on the Northern Plains had ended years earlier. Jurisdiction moved to the Interior Department and its Indian office. Yet, whenever fear rose, the War Department re-entered the field. Agency schools expanded under a civilizing policy. Boarding schools in far towns and on eastern tracts took children from their languages for months at a time. Permits governed travel. Passes and patrols marked who could cross from camp to town. Ceremonies were watched for signs that officials labeled as agitation. In this climate, a movement that asked for moral reform and community dance could be framed as either devotion or threat. Immediate triggers built across 1890. Reports of large dances near Pine Ridge and Rosebud reached Washington by telegraph in late summer. A Standing Rock official labeled the movement dangerous and asked for authority to arrest leaders if needed. At Pine Ridge, a new agent in late autumn sent urgent dispatches and asked for troops. Disarmament protocols and arrest plans followed. None of this erased hunger or cold or grief for the dead. Those facts moved families into camp clusters on ridges and in draws where they felt safer than under the agency flag. Objectives diverged and could not be reconciled by speed alone. For Oglala, Lakota, Oyate, and Hunkpapa, Lakota, the near aim was survival through winter with dignity and order. The longer aim was continuance of people, land, and law under their own leadership. The ceremony offered structure fasting moral conduct and a promise of reunion that lessened despair. For agents, the near aim was quiet agencies on the way to allotment and school compliance. The longer aim was conversion of communal land to surveyed parcels and the ending of what they called tribal authority. These aims set the argument that shaped every telegram. Constraints were material and strict. Lakota camps faced ration cuts, weak beef, and early snow. Ammunition and arms varied by household. Mobility was by horse with elders and children in wagons. Interpreters were essential and scarce. Messages moved by kin and by runners. Agencies had food stores that did not meet expectation and staff who counted sacks in lamplight. The Army had rail and winter stock, but limited knowledge of local trails. It could mass a regiment near an agency in days, yet could not create trust in a night. Orders from distant desks met creek crossings and blizzards. Misread signals were common in both directions. Logistics snapshots show the imbalance. The government could telegraph from agency to department in minutes and put companies in motion from Fort Meade, Fort Robinson, and Fort Niobrara within days. Cavalry columns brought rations, tents, and Hotchkiss guns on wagons and could enforce cordons around an agency. Communities moved lighter and knew the country. They could disperse beyond lines into the Badlands near Stronghold Table and regroup by family circle. But winter narrowed that advantage. Water holes froze. Grass went under snow. Sick children slowed the pace of every decision. Under those conditions, fear traveled faster than explanation and set the terms for what followed. Late spring 1890 set the pattern of movement and alarm. From Arapaho and Cheyenne country to the Oglala and Hunkpapa agencies, the news of the round dance traveled by riders who knew the creek crossings and by letters copied in agency rooms. Each step brought a larger circle and a tighter response. Summer heat on the plains dried grass early. By harvest time, the wind carried dust along the rail grades. The season shaped choices. The first clear incident took form in June 1890 when delegations that had gone west the previous winter and spring came home through Darlington Agency and then north by stages toward Pine Ridge Agency and Rosebud Agency. These were mixed groups of kin and allies who had sat with Wovoka and heard the teaching in Nevada. They returned with a moral code, the dance pattern, and a conviction that ceremony could bind loss to order. At Pine Ridge, the first circles formed on flats beyond the main buildings. The Oglala Lakota, Oyate watched and weighed. Elders spoke for caution. Young men spoke for renewal. Interpreters stood between languages and emphasized different lines of the message depending on memory and audience. The agency noted larger gatherings in its daily book and sent a first cautious telegraph east. Weather held through July, and with good footing the circles grew. Dancers rotated until dawn, pausing for prayer and water. These were not secret meetings, but they were not staged for agents either. By August, the Pine Ridge agent recorded repeated dances near White Clay and Porcupine. Word moved north to Standing Rock that the movement had taken root among the Oglala and that some Hunkpapa families had begun to copy the form and songs in their own camps. The Hunkpapa were under ration strain from the previous winter and watched soldiers on the rails and roads. In late August, the Standing Rock office sent a more forceful set of wires to department heads, describing the ceremony as agitation and naming figures to watch. A courier system in the camps answered with its own speed, carrying news of those wires and prompting some families to shift camps away from agency eyes. The second incident gathered weight in September and October 1890, as agents on the northern plains began to align their views and coordinate with the Army. At Pine Ridge, the agent reported that dances persisted, despite warnings to leaders that they must stop or move within sight of the agency. At Rosebud, the tone was similar, but less urgent. At Standing Rock, the agent framed the dances as a direct challenge to authority and recommendation for arrests moved from draft to request. The telegraph made such alignment possible in hours. Yet on the ground, the signals were slower, and sometimes bent by weather and language. A message sent at dusk from an agency room might not reach an outlying camp until the following afternoon. An interpreter's choice of one verb or another could tilt a warning into a threat. Meanwhile, rumors moved without wires. Shirts marked with sacred emblems appeared in some circles. Whether these were treated as ritual protection or as badges of prayer depended on who was looking and what words were used. Fact and folklore braided together. The Army took notice of the shirts and what officers believed they signified. The communities held to the songs and what elders said they meant. By early November, the snow came in bands across the Badlands and the tall grass country. Travel grew slow. Families shifted their lodges to more sheltered draws and ridges. This created the third pressure point as distance and weather changed how officials read the map. To the agency, the movement of lodges away from the main road and the visible fields looked like evasion. To the families, it was normal winter practice adjusted for the need to avoid sudden arrests. Road watch teams from the agencies and from the Army began to count lodges and draft estimates. Telegraphs multiplied. Pine Ridge asked for reinforcement. Standing Rock renewed its call for permission to arrest named leaders. Fort Meade and Fort Niobrara reported readiness. At this stage, seizures began. Horses were taken in a few cases where the agency claimed misuse. Rifles were demanded in others. These actions had immediate effects. Men who had worked as scouts or in agency details walked away from posts and took their families deeper into the draws where cousins were already camped. The number of dancers in those places increased even as some headmen urged a pause. One dispatch line from Standing Rock in mid-November shows the administrative voice that set the next decision. McLaughlin, letter extract, Standing Rock Agency, 9/11/15. The dance continues at outlying camps, and I am satisfied it tends to excitement and mischief. I respectfully request authority to arrest and confine the leaders should they refuse to desist and come in when ordered. Troops may be necessary if resistance is offered. After this request, the pace shifted again. In the last weeks of November, an interior directive authorized closer coordination with the Army, where agents feared disorder. At Pine Ridge, the agent kept up a split track, sending envoys to ask certain bands to return near the agency while telegraphing for troops if they did not. Young man. Afraid, and other Oglala leaders worked as intermediaries, taking messages both ways and pressing to keep families from panic. Snow settled over the flats. The telegraph hut snapped with cold in the wires. On many days, couriers moved faster than interpreters could be found. The fourth incident began at dawn on 14th December 1890 in the Hunkpapa camps along the Grand River. The Standing Rock agent had issued an arrest order for Sitting Bull. Indian police went in before first light. The cold air carried voices. A struggle broke out. Shots were fired at close range. Several policemen and Sitting Bull were killed. The arrest failed, and in the hours after, families broke from the river camps and rode hard for safety. This did not end the dance, but it transformed the frame. To Hunkpapa and to many at Pine Ridge, it was proof that officials would take men by force despite winter and counsel. To officials, it was proof of armed resistance. Both readings hardened. The immediate effect was displacement on a wide scale as riders cut south and west toward places beyond the easy reach of posts and agency gates. In the days that followed, the Army columns at Pine Ridge intensified patrols. The agency set stricter passes. Interpreters were sent with flags of truce to named headmen. The same interpreters were also called to read orders of disarmament. Lines crossed in the snow. At Porcupine and near Stronghold Table, Oglala camps pulled tight and set pickets. At the railheads, officers counted carloads and sent for more blankets and rations, anticipating that families might come in if safe conduct could be guaranteed. Yet the memory of the Grand River morning hung over every meeting. What one side called an unfortunate necessity, the other called a breaking of trust. By the third week of December, an intercepted mini-Conjou band under Spotted Elk, also known as Bigfoot, was being tracked as it moved toward Pine Ridge, seeking protection with friends and kin. Messages about this movement passed between agency and Army by wire and rider. Snow and wind slowed all parties. Misread distances and misheard place names crept into reports. The stage that opened in June, with returned delegates and songs, was now rimmed by wagons, patrols, and orders. Pressure had escalated at each step, and now rested on frozen ground. The next decisions would not be made in council houses, but at road junctions and creek beds where cold fear and command met in the space of a few yards. The order of movement formed in November 1890 and hardened after the Grand River arrest failed on 14th December. Interior officials authorized closer coordination with the Army where agents feared disorder. At Pine Ridge Agency, the agent requested troops to support disarmament and to steady roads and telegraph stations. Commanders at Fort Meade, Fort Niobrara, and Fort Robinson signaled readiness and began to shift companies toward the Northern Plains agencies. The core of the field force near Pine Ridge included elements of the 7th Cavalry, with companies drawn from several troops, Indian scouts, and detachments of artillery with light mountain guns commonly called Hotchkiss guns. Supply wagons carried rations, blankets, and ammunition. The Indian police remained on post at each agency tasked to execute arrests under civil authority when possible. The march can be read in short lines, from Fort Meade to the rail stop and onward, by road to the vicinity of Pine Ridge, from Fort Niobrara south and west along river crossings that would freeze at dusk and thaw in the weak midday sun. From Fort Robinson across wind-cut draws toward Rosebud and Pine Ridge. The ground was a patchwork of creek bends, cottonwood stands, and open flats that would drift with snow after each storm band. Choke points were not bridges, so much as narrow timber lines and steep creek banks that slowed wagons and forced riders to bunch within easy voice distance. Commanders noted the difficulty of keeping formation in fine powder snow and the need to hold horses in the lee of ridges when wind turned sharp. Rules of engagement were written in the language of arrest and disarmament. The Standing Rock agent signed an order dated 14th of December to arrest Sitting Bull, directing Indian police to bring him in for questioning about the dance and to break any potential armed gathering at his camp. The Pine Ridge agent sent wires in late November and early December requesting authority to disarm bands beyond the agency's immediate control and to bring them inside the agency line for oversight. Interior consented to Army support where resistance appeared likely. In staff rooms at the agencies, these rules read as measured steps. On cold roads at pre-dawn, they could not control how voices carried or how a hand moved toward a rifle. The first contact of this phase is fixed. At Standing Rock, on 14 December, Indian police entered the Grand River camp before first light. The air was still and soundless, then loud with orders in Lakota and in English. Sitting Bull died in the struggle that followed. Several Indian policemen fell with him. In later testimony, the timing and the choice to enter at dawn were defended as necessary to avoid rallying. In the camps, the same facts read as a violation of counsel and season. The immediate tactical outcome was a scattered flight of families and armed men southward and westward, beyond the easy reach of the post. Strategically, it set both sides on a track that the winter would harden rather than soften. At Pine Ridge, the agent now faced an anxious field. Dancers and non-dancers alike moved toward the Badlands uplands near Stronghold Table. Some headmen who had argued against the dance now worked to bring people in under flags of truce. Others thought distance the only safety. The agent telegraphed for reinforcement and set pass rules tighter at the gate. The Army established picket lines on roads east and north of the agency and posted observers on ridges that overlooked likely lodge grounds. In these days, couriers moved under white cloths pinned to poles, and interpreters walked between fire lines to repeat and clarify. The Army offered amnesty for those who came in and disarmed. Families who doubted the offer remained in the draws. By the week before Christmas, the field command at Pine Ridge had orders to escort any large moving bands into the agency limits and to secure weapons before entry. This was not an abstract instruction. Ammunition was to be stacked under guard. Rifles were to be held until officers judged the situation quiet. A short order captured the tone of this directive. Department Headquarters Officer Order Extract, near Pine Ridge, 1890 to 1222. Escort bands peaceably to the agency. Disarm without needless force. Avoid firing unless fired upon. Protect women and children. Report numbers by company daily. The next march line concerned the Minneconne Jew under Spotted Elk, also known as Bigfoot. After the Grand River killing, he led his sick body south from the Cheyenne River country, aiming for friends and kin near Pine Ridge. The weather worsened. Riders brought word to the agency and to Army pickets that a large band with many women and children was on the move. A column of the 7th Cavalry intercepted the band on 28th of December along the White River country and directed them toward a campsite at Wounded Knee Creek for the night. The ground was wind-scoured and open with a few willows along the creek bed. The band was surrounded by companies positioned on low rises. Artillery set their small guns on the slopes to the north. Medical wagons came up late. Blankets were short against the cold. The plan for the morning of 29th of December was disarmament and escort into the agency. Interpreters were to call men forward to stack rifles. A count was to be made of weapons and of people. The Hotchkiss guns were to remain trained, but not to fire. The distance between armed men and the circle of lodges was measured in a few dozen yards. Dogs moved between lines. Children watched the horses and the rifles. What happened next has many versions. The center of each version is that close-range searching for weapons became disorder. A firearm discharged at close range. Men jumped. Some grabbed at rifles. Soldiers fired. The small guns on the slopes opened within minutes. Within an hour, the camp was a field of bodies and drifting snow. Casualty ranges depend on source. Most modern syntheses place Lakota dead over 250, with a high proportion of women and children. Army dead and wounded were far fewer, but included men killed at the first surge of close fighting. The immediate humanitarian outcome was grim and urgent. Survivors tried to flee along the creek beds and over the low rises. Columns sent out details to bring in the wounded. Some were carried on travois to the agency. Others were left until daylight cleared the storm and the fear of ambush. The ground froze around those who did not move. Medical staff worked in agency rooms lit by oil lamps through the day and into night. Names were taken when possible. Many were not written. An after-action voice from the Army side carried both defense and sorrow. Field Officer After Action Extract, Wounded Knee, Creek Men 1230. We surrounded the village as ordered to secure arms and prevent escape. A struggle began during the search and firing became general at once. Many non-combatants were among the dead. I submit that the plan failed to account for distance and the presence of children. Logistics stress appeared at every step. The army had ammunition and rails but could not conjure trust. Its columns moved with ration wagons, yet blankets ran short for those not on the rolls. The agency had ledgers and passbooks but no spare interpreters. On the Lakota side, families had mobility and knowledge of country, but were slowed by elders and infants and by winter illness. Each hour of delay brought colder wind and less light, the very tools meant to shorten coordination. The telegraph keys and the railroad timetables could not change how a voice sounded at dawn, when a door was pushed in or a rifle was tugged from a man's hands. Resistance and negotiation continued even amid shock. At Pine Ridge in the days after Wounded Knee, Oglala leaders who had held back from the dance pressed for an end to columns moving against scattered camps. Young Man Afraid met with officers near the agency line and argued for safe conduct for families still in the draws. Some bands came in and were disarmed without incident. Others remained out until weather and hunger pressed them toward shelter. The Army conducted inquiries and reassigned an officer. General Nelson Miles arrived to review the scene and wrote language that later readers would note as an early official use of the word massacre for what had happened at Wounded Knee Creek. Administrative paper flowed even as graves under snow marked the hour. Fact and folklore disputes remain in the record. Some contemporary observers claimed that shirts worn by certain dancers were believed to stop bullets. Others present said the shirts were devotional garments only and that no serious man expected them to turn iron. The record is mixed. What can be said with care is that belief and badge were read by officers through a lens of fear, and that fear fed plans written at desks far from creek beds and winter lodges. By mid-January 1891, the campaign phase ended in a slow drawdown. The Army pulled back to posts as the agency's reasserted routine. Lists were closed, guns kept by the quartermaster were released in part and retained in part. Surviving families settled near agency buildings or moved to distant kin when roads allowed. The national press printed columns of argument about the meaning of the event. Within the communities, winter counts marked the year with signs that would be read by children who had not yet been born. The confrontation phase had done more than send men to the field. It had set the limits of policy language when placed against the realities of cold fear and proximity. The next chapter would deal less with orders of march and more with the weight of records and the insistence of continuance. The turning point was a sequence with 3 fixed anchors. Huminikonju Lakota, under Spotted Elk also known as Bigfoot, surrounded by companies of the 7th Cavalry with supporting artillery, where the flats and low rises along Wounded Knee Creek near Pine Ridge Agency. When the morning of 1890, 12/29, after a freezing night under guard, the objective on paper was simple: disarm the band and escort it into the agency. The real objectives diverged. The Army sought compliance under winter pressure with no loss of control. The families sought safety with dignity after the killing at Grand River and the long ride in snow. Constraints were visible in every direction. Ammunition was abundant in the perimeter lines and stacked in wagons. Ammunition among the Miniconjou varied by household and by what had already been taken the day before. Rations for the soldiers were secure, though always tight in winter. Rations for the camp were thin and counted against agency rolls that did not match bodies on the ground. Orders told officers to disarm without needless force and to avoid firing unless fired upon. Orders do not fix distance. The creek bed curved between lodges and gun positions. Children stood near men who were being searched. A gust could lift a tent flap and draw eyes. Weather was the last constraint and the first fact. The air was sharp. Hands were stiff. Breath hung in front of faces and cut the seconds in which choices were made. The immediate effect after the first closed discharge was not a battle line in any formal sense. It was a collapse of proximity into noise. Men grabbed at rifles or ran. Soldiers fired from the ring and from the slopes. Within minutes, light guns opened from above the camp. Initiative did not shift so much as vanish. The Army controlled the ground by weight of fire and by position. The camp ceased to be a camp and became a field of bodies in motion. Attempts to rally by any Miniconjou fighters were brief and local. Mothers tried to pull children behind lodge covers that could not stop shot. Doctors and littermen from the Army moved after the firing slackened, but the effect of that movement was humanitarian only at the edges of what had already been done. The admission against interest came from a senior officer who reviewed the scene and the reports that followed. Nelson Miles' letter extract, Pine Ridge, 1891-01. I am forced to conclude that what occurred at Wounded Knee was not a necessary act of war, but a deplorable and cruel slaughter. The plan of disarmament placed armed troops too near terrified families. The result was inevitable once fear became the only command. That assessment did not undo the dead. It did fix the moral center of the turning point in official language. It also matched what survivors said in later testimony and in winter counts that marked the year with a single sign for many bodies on the snow. Counterfactual lines must be narrow and grounded. If the escort had halted the band well outside the camp circle and separated men from families by a measured distance, the search might have avoided the ignition that close searching produced. If the arrest of Sitting Bull had not been attempted before daylight 2 weeks earlier, some Hunkpapa and Miniconjo families might have reached Pine Ridge under parley rather than under guard, and the ground at Wounded Knee might never have been chosen as a staging point. These ifs show choice is not magic. They do not remove the structural forces that drove the winter. Human cost should be stated with names when they are preserved and with care when they are not. Spotted elk died on the snow after riding south, fevered and coughing. Among the dead were women and children whose names were not entered in ledgers that night. Indian police who had fallen at Grand River earlier in the month were already in the count of winter grief. Army dead were fewer, but present in every after-action list. Survivors carried infants to the agency in blankets and found rooms cleared for the wounded. Burial parties worked in storms. In the winter counts kept by several bands, the event was rendered as the year they were killed at Wounded Knee, or with a glyph of a line of bodies in snow. Ledger drawings from the following years show the same curve of creek and the same shots drawn as dots from the slopes. Displacement paths can be traced in short sentences. Hunkpapa, who had scattered after the Grand River morning, rode south and west and then back toward Standing Rock when passes were restored. Miniconjo survivors gathered at Pine Ridge for a time and then followed kin lines to other agencies when the roads opened. Oglala families who had sheltered near Stronghold Table came in under flags or moved out to distant relatives when the army drew down. These movements were not abstractions. They were daily lists of who ate and where a child slept. They also set the base for censuses and ration ledgers that would define policy for the next decade. The turning point must be synthesized back to the deeper frame. The structural forces laid out in the buildup made a winter ignition likely once fear overtook dialogue. Allotment and the 1889 division of the Great Sioux Reservation had reduced land and mobility. Ration cuts had increased hunger. The shift from war to interior changed language, but not the readiness to send troops when an agent wired for help. Railroads compressed time for the army and for rumor. Telegraph keys made fear move faster than correction. Boarding schools had already widened the gap between some young people and elders, shaping how messages were heard and which rules were trusted. When a ceremony that promised moral reform and renewal crossed that landscape, it was read through the lens the landscape provided. A shirt could become a weapon in an officer's report. A dance could be weighed as an assembly rather than a devotion. At Wounded Knee, the constraints of winter and closeness made those lenses lethal. Orders assumed that disarmament could be a clean administrative act, though it placed rifles within arm's reach of children and set light guns within a few dozen yards of lodges. Once a weapon fired at close range, the geometry of the camp decided the rest. The army held height and arc. The families had no distance and no cover. Initiative went to whoever could end the scene fastest, and that meant fire from the slopes. The turning point, therefore, is not measured only in who moved first or last, but in how policy, language, terrain, and weather together eliminated any middle path. The shock of the morning at Wounded Knee ended the ghost dance as an open movement on the northern plains. It did not end the underlying pressures, nor the continuance of the people who had danced. The army would withdraw in stages. The Indian office would close its inquiries with language of order restored, but the cost set limits on what trust could be rebuilt under the same rules. The ceremony's songs would be recorded years later in careful rooms. The place name would enter national memory as both a site and a verdict. The winter of 1890 shows how a turning point can be made when an administrative plan meets snow hunger and fear, and how a promise of renewal can be forced into silence without being erased. The administrative trail began within days. Boards of inquiry convened at Pine Ridge in early January 1891 to review the disarmament plan, casualty lists, and troop conduct. Department correspondents folded these findings into the annual report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, which framed the winter as a security crisis while recommitting to allotment and school policy. The report language stressed order and progress. Ledger tables tracked annuities, beef issues, and enrollments that had already been strained before the snow. Law and administration moved on parallel tracks. Arrests made in December were regularized or dropped as the Army drew down and agency authority resumed. Reservation boundaries fixed by the 1889 agreement stayed in force now, enforced with tighter pass systems and closer oversight of travel between agency towns and winter camps. Transfers of individuals and families occurred by wagon and rail under escort to consolidate populations near agency centers. In Washington, files from Standing Rock and Pine Ridge were abstracted into summaries that carried the language of restored quiet rather than of loss. The paper order closed the incident even as names remained missing in field books. Rations and annuities became instruments of both relief and control. Emergency beef issues followed the killings, then returned to contracted levels. Warehouse ledgers show shortages attributed to freight delays and contract disputes with local agents requesting authority to reallocate flour and bacon to households with wounded or orphaned children. The same ledgers also record new school placements for survivors, a policy choice meant to accelerate assimilation and to disperse authority from elders to institutions. The administrative logic visible in the annual report and agency copybooks held that order would return through allotment schooling and surveillance. Land and resource regimes continued with few concessions. Grazing leases expanded across former common ranges. Small rail spurs and telegraph offices anchored agency towns and facilitated contract shipments. The Black Hills mining economy remained outside Lakota control, but its freight corridors shaped labor markets and surveillance on the plains. These conditions appear not as narrative flourishes, but as tables of contracts, right-of-way, permits, and receipts, which show the pressure points that fed the crisis and endured after it. Demography and health are written in lines as spare as the winter itself. Census schedules for 1891 show households recomposed by death and dispersal. Mortality rose in the months after December, a curve associated in agency remarks with exposure injuries and respiratory disease among the wounded and displaced. Birth registrations fell for the same period. Such notes are terse, but they reinforce what survivors describe: a winter of grief, cold, and travel between agency rooms and distant kin. Mooney's field compilation, made later in the decade and anchored to interviews and agency figures, set those demographic shifts beside testimonies of displacement and loss. Cultural continuance persisted under pressure. Songs of the Ghost Dance were recorded on experimental discs in 1894, a fact that shows both federal interest in cataloging Native culture and Native insistence on carrying memory in sound even after the ceremony had been driven from agency grounds. The Library of Congress notes that the recordings likely captured versions sung or prompted by Mooney in a documentation setting, not a public circle, which underlines how practice moved into guarded spaces without vanishing. Memory took multiple forms. Winter counts rendered the year as a line of bodies in snow, or as the year they were killed, at Wounded Knee, a single glyph holding a season. Ledger art in the following years placed creek curves and firing arcs in stark perspective. Later federal investigations and historical surveys of the battlefield fixed place names and distances, while acknowledging the large number of women and children among the dead. Those government and academic records, sober in tone, now sit alongside Lakota accounts that had long named the event as massacre before the word gained currency in official correspondence. The administrative aftermath also produced its own contradictions. Senior officers argued over language and blame. General Nelson Miles, in private and official exchanges, described what he saw and read from the scene as a needless slaughter brought on by a flawed plan that placed armed troops too close to terrified families. That formulation, preserved in scholarship and correspondence excerpts, is an admission against interest within the military record and marks a pivot in how federal documents would frame the event over time. Present-day, continuance is not an epilogue but a through line. Oglala Lakota, Oyate on Pine Ridge Reservation, and Hunkpapa Lakota at Standing Rock live with active cultural, legal, and educational programs. Annual commemorations and memorial rides each December retrace winter roads to Wounded Knee, bind families across agencies, and place prayer at the site. Contemporary scholarship centered on Lakota voices, such as Ronnie Henrich Anderson's synthesis, consolidates agency reports, Army files, and Native testimonies to show how a revitalization movement met ration cuts, allotment, and armed enforcement. The work underscores that the Ghost Dance did not disappear. It transformed under surveillance, survived as memory and song, and remains part of a living intellectual and ceremonial world. In policy terms, the winter closed with the Army withdrawn to posts and interior routine restored. In live terms, the aftermath lasted for years in school placements, allotments, surveyed and reassigned, and in the quiet choices of where families would live each season. That duality is the core of continuity after crisis. Administrative files show closure. Community records show endurance. When we read the ledgers and the winter counts together, we see why the Ghost Dance was not only an episode, but a register of structural forces already at work. The contraction of land, the regulation of movement, the ration economy, and the weight of external schools. These forces, documented in annual reports and in Mooney's compilation, explain why the song survived even when the circles could not stand in the open. The scene at Wounded Knee remains a legal and moral reference point. Battlefield surveys, agency reports, and modern histories align on the core facts of non-combatant deaths at scale and on the logistical and command failures that made that outcome likely once fear overtook dialogue. That consensus sits beside community commemorations and recordings that keep names and songs alive. After the winter of 1890, the people endured, the policies persisted, and the memory took on a duty that reaches into the present. Across a century of scholarship, several conclusions hold steady. The ghost dance moved along kin routes, delegations, and letters from Nevada to the northern plains in 1889 and 1890. Local forms reflected local needs and stress. Federal fear and the decision to enforce arrests and disarmament with military support accelerated confrontation rather than calming it. The killings at Wounded Knee on 1890-12-29 are now widely described as a massacre, with a large number of women and children among the dead, not a conventional battle line between armed forces. Contested points remain. Exact casualty totals vary by report and by method of counting on a frozen field. Modern syntheses often place Lakota deaths at more than 250, while noting lower Army losses. Responsibility is also debated. Some writers center a close-range spark during disarmament, while others emphasize command decisions that put artillery and riflemen within yards of a camp. Even among Army voices, the language diverged. General Nelson Miles's private and official letters condemned what he called a needless slaughter, a judgment that later inquiries could not erase. The debate over medals of honor awarded to participating soldiers has continued into the present, with repeated legislative attempts to rescind the awards as inconsistent with the facts of the day. The enduring legacy is threefold. First, in doctrine and policy, the winter of 1890 exposed the limits of administrative language when applied to armed enforcement among families in snow. Later federal histories and park designations acknowledged the predominance of non-combatant deaths and fixed the site in national memory. Second, in communal life, Oglala Lakota, Oyate, and Hunkpapa Lakota continued ceremony language and commemorations under pressure. Winter counts, ledger art, and annual memorial rides turned grief into a durable archive. Third, in scholarship, the record has widened from Indian office and Army files to include Lakota testimonies and the long arc of the ghost dance as a religious and social movement, a frame set early by James Mooney and deepened by modern studies. The event endures in memory because it shows how a ceremony of hope carried by letters and kin met a state that answered with force in winter, and how the human cost fixed a place and a date as a national wound that communities still mark and survive. The story ends at Wounded Knee, but its echo lives on in songs, memorial rides, and today's classrooms. How should we remember in a way that honors truth? And people leave a comment and share this video so more can learn. Thank you for watching.